Hello, Latin 1. Today we are going to be talking about your stage 15 culture. So you're going to need page 12 and 13. I actually just recorded like a really awesome video for this and then it got deleted. I'm so angry. Technology, I swear. Anyways, hopefully your technology is working today so that you can watch this video in order to complete your culture pages more easily. But, hopefully the gods are smiling upon you. Obviously, they're not smiling upon me right now, so I'm trying this for a second time. Make sure today, while I'm gone, this Monday, that you are completing pages 12 and 13 about the culture, and also your derivatives on page 3. Okay, so we're going to check all of this when I come back on Wednesday. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Celts, the native people in Britain, whether they were friend or foe to the Romans, because depending on what time period you look at or where in Britain you are looking at, you can answer this question in several different ways. What you see here is Hadrian's Wall in the 100s AD. The Emperor Hadrian was having such a struggle with the people in the northern part of this island that he was like, you know what? Not worth it. We are not going to gain anything by taking them under Roman control, and it's just too much work in order to try to fight them off all the time. So we're going to be like Donald Trump and we're going to build a wall across northern Britain. I'll show you a picture of where it goes later. But here you can see the remains of it. It's a lot shorter now because it's just the remains, but in ancient times it would have been anywhere from 19 to 30 feet tall. And along the wall there would be military stations, and like you'd have to pass through gates in order to get to the other side, and traffic was regulated, and it was kind of crazy. But then again, the tribes that lived north of the wall were also kind of crazy. So talking about the Celts, right? We know based on everything that we've talked about that the Celts lived in an agricultural society. This isn't a bad thing. It doesn't mean just because they're in an agricultural society that they are uncivilized. But when the Romans first come in, that's what they interpreted as, because they think that people who don't live in cities are barbarians. And so they lived in tribes rather than one group under major control. And they were led by religious priests called Druids. The Druids were the driving force behind like the anti-Roman sentiment in Britain. They were not about the Romans rolling in there and taking over. But depending on where they were and depending on who they were, they received the Romans quite differently. Also, it has to do with the fact that like what time period they were dealing with the Romans, what Roman general they were dealing with. Like their experiences varied widely, as you'll see. Okay, the Romans, though, when they roll into town, they want to do what's called Romanization. And Romanization is basically making the conquered people as Roman as possible. Teach them Latin, have them live in Roman-style houses, worship Roman gods, adapt Roman-style dress and hair. Okay, it's like they want to take away everything that's native and just replace it with Roman sentiments. And when you think about the implications of that and like the loss of native culture, it's actually pretty sad. They could be arrogant and insensitive, as we'll see in our next slide. It can get pretty bad. They believed that they were supreme and that everybody else was inferior, so they encouraged the British colonies to accept Roman laws and customs. They imposed those laws upon the British no matter what. So sometimes there was abuse of power in this, and that is where some problems arise. Okay. So you should have the chart filled at the top of page 12 in your packet. All right, so now we're going to talk about when things go poorly for the Romans, especially with this queen named Boudica. Boudica was unique because she was married to the king of the Iceni tribe, Iceni, and her husband, Prausutagus, he died, and so, but the British didn't believe that like everything had to be led by men. They didn't they believed that women could hold positions of power, unlike the Romans. And so when her husband died, she took over as the leader of their tribe, and the Romans saw this as a threat. As we've talked about a couple different times, the Romans felt like women were useful for having babies. And so when Boudica was the leader of their tribe, they were already threatened by her. And when the Romans marched into town and said, like, hey, you need to give up your land to us, she refused, and rightfully so. I mean, it wasn't the Romans to take. And in exchange, the Romans did not treat her or her people very kindly. In fact, they raped her daughters and attacked her people. And this caused Boudica to go on an all-out rebellion against the Romans. She went on a campaign of burning down several Roman towns, and she was actually successful in burning down a number of Roman towns before she was stopped. It took the Romans a little bit of time to gather themselves, right? They were taken by surprise with Boudica's rebellion, and so they had to gather and muster up forces. And even though they were outnumbered, their military style and planning was superior to the British, and they were able to be successful. Boudica, though, was not about to be taken hostage by the Romans, and she actually decides to commit suicide and kills herself rather than be taken hostage. If she had been taken hostage by the Romans, she could have suffered a terrible fate. Remember, we've talked about how the Romans were especially fond of public strangulation, where they would take their prisoners of war and march them on parade all throughout the city, and then end the parade with strangling them in front of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Super awesome. So at the end, the Romans were successful in putting down the rebellion, but Boudica was not taken alive. It's not always like this, right? We have other leaders and tribes that handled the Romans very positively. For instance, Cartumandua. Before I talk about her, I just want to point out a few things. Okay, in green, you see all of these different tribes. The Iceni, Boudica's tribe were here. Cartumandua's tribe is farther north. Up here is the wall which Hadrian built across the most narrow part of Britain, and to keep the raiders from the north out. But before that happened, Cartumandua openly welcomed the Romans. She was obviously dealing with a different set of soldiers, and they treated her fairly and with respect, and she welcomed them, and in return, they offered her defense from the wilder tribes of the north. So it was kind of like a two-way street that happened there. So the situation was more positive for Cartumandua. It didn't always have to be violence. Okay, so coming back to our stories specifically, we have our king, and we have his name is Cogidubnus, and we're going to talk about him now because he was actually a real man, kind of like how we know about Caecilius from the documents found in Pompeii. We know about Salvius based on some historians. We know about Cogidubnus based on a temple inscription. He was originally just the chief of the Atrebates, and as I go back here, the Atrebates were here in the south. But when the Romans took over, he kind of took over this entire southern part of Britain, and everybody came under this one blanket tribe called the Regnenses. So they were originally they were originally before the Roman invasion, the Atrebates, and afterwards the Regnenses. And we know he was real because information about him was found on a dedicatory stone at the temple of Neptune and Minerva that looks just like this. the temple to Neptune and Minerva for their safety, for our safety, right? The divine home from the kindness or from the authority. Claudius Cogidubnus gives this to you. And it goes on to talk about how it was built by the College of Craftsmen. And we know that he paid dona, right? He paid for the temple, and that he was the benefactor for this. So this was how we know Cogidubnus was definitely a real guy. He was kind of like Cartumandua in that he was loyal and welcoming to the Romans, and he was bestowed an honor called a client king. Okay, when you're a client king, one word to describe a client king: a puppet. Right? You don't have absolute. That's an E. Oh, that's so terrible. Anyways, you don't have absolute power. You answer to the emperor. You rule on behalf of the emperor. You enforce the laws and the policies of the emperor. You tax the people in the name of the emperor. So you are a puppet king, a figurehead. You don't have any actual authority without the consent of the emperor. But we have a couple of interesting things about Cogidubnus. He encourages the assimilation of the Roman gods. Okay, this whole idea of Romanization and Romanizing, right? After emperors died, they became worshipped as gods, and if they were good. And this was something that was really, really popular in Britain, especially of the Emperor Claudius. Claudius was kind of the first emperor to come into Britain after Julius Caesar had invaded, and so he was treated like very well. The people in Britain were forced to treat him very well. The capital city that we know Cogidubnus ruled from due to the location of the temple, okay, is this place called Noviomagus. And here there's been an expansive palace that's been nicknamed Fishbourne. Fun story about Fishbourne. One day in the early 20th century, I guess, they were building a road in this area that was kind of more like rural, and they came upon mosaics. And so they stopped building and they called in the Archaeological Society. And when the Archaeological Society investigated further, they realized that this area contained all the foundations for an expansive palatial complex. Now, nowhere in Fishbourne does it say like, oh, Cogidubnus lived here, but it's based on the size of this palace, we assume that this is probably where a king would have lived, and considering there have been no other buildings found that are equivalent to this, we can make that kind of assumption. So the capital, Noviomagus, the palace, Fishbourne. Okay, so we're going to get into Fishbourne more in depth next chapter. That's kind of our focus there, and you should have been able to complete pages 12 and 13 with no difficulty today, okay, using this video. And make sure that you have page 3 completed, and I will see you on Wednesday. Walete omnes.